Come in, get low, let your shoulders drop the way they drop right before sleep actually takes you, that half second where the day finally lets go of your spine. Tonight, we are not going to talk about Finn's sword, or Jake's stretchy powers, or the Ice King's crown, not directly, not as the main subject anyway. Tonight, we are going somewhere most people who love this show have walked past 100 times without noticing the door was even there. We are going into the parts of the land of Oo that only show up when someone is asleep, or dying, or already dead, or dealing in magic dark enough that even Princess Bubblegum pretends not to know about it. The dreams that are not dreams. The underworld that has its own weather and its own furniture. The demon who eats souls the way other fathers forget birthdays. The vampires who are really a deck of tarot cards wearing skin. And underneath all of it, a theory about magic that one heartbroken woman wrote down in a notebook. A theory that quietly explains almost every tragic wizard in the whole show and that almost nobody talks about because it was buried in a single strange episode about a coconut crab in a swimming pool. This is the version of Adventure Time that exists behind the version everyone remembers. Close your eyes if you want. You can still hear everything. Nobody built this part of the world for you to notice on a first watch, and that's exactly why it's worth going down there together tonight. There is a bird that most fans first meet as a joke, and the joke is that he is one of the most quietly terrifying entities in the entire mythology of the show, dressed up in feathers and an old man's voice, wandering into people's dreams like a man checking a box on a clipboard. He is called the Cosmic Owl, and the rule around him is deceptively simple, stated plainly, and without ceremony the first few times the show brings him up. If the Cosmic Owl appears in your dream, that dream is going to come true. Not might, not could, will. It is not a warning. It is not a symbol you get to interpret away over breakfast. It is closer to a stamp on a piece of paperwork that has already been filed somewhere you cannot see, a notarization performed while you were unconscious, on a document you did not know you were signing. He first shows up in a Season 1 episode, Prisoners of Love, inside the Ice King's own imagination, and the show does something small and clever there that most viewers do not register on a first watch. It plants him in a place that feels safe, a mental space belonging to a comic, harmless antagonist, and lets him say something genuinely cutting to the Ice King's face, telling him flatly that he is a sociopath before the Ice King brushes it off and calls him a nerd, and the scene moves on like nothing happened. That is the Cosmic Owl in miniature. He tells you something true and enormous, and then the show cuts away to a joke, and you are left holding the true and enormous thing by yourself while everyone else laughs. The show builds him slowly after that, the way it builds almost everything, dropping him into episodes as a background detail like before it ever explains what he is for. He shows up at the end of Jake's Croak Dream in the episode The New Frontier, a nightmare involving a banana man and a rocket ship, and Jake suffocating in space without a helmet, and Finn and Jake's conversation afterward treats his appearance as confirmation of something they both already understand without needing it spelled out. A croak dream is a dream that shows you how you are going to die. Jake says it plainly. He says it is impossible to cheat it, and then, almost as an aside, he adds something that sits heavier the longer you think about it, that Finn's presence in his life has been the thing postponing that particular death, and that when Finn is not around anymore, the dream will happen again. Sit with that for a second. A dog who can stretch himself into a house or a boat or a bridge, who is one of the most resilient and adaptable characters in the entire show, has already been shown by the universe itself exactly how he goes. And the only reason it has not happened yet is a specific person's continued presence in his life. Adventure Time hands you this in about 90 seconds of dialogue and then moves on to the next joke, the way it hands you almost everything that matters. He surfaces again in The Lich on a television screen inside one of Finn's dreams, confirming after the fact that what Finn witnessed there was not an ordinary nightmare, but a genuine premonition, a small piece of the future arriving early and uninvited. And he shows up in Frost and Fire in one of his most quietly devastating appearances, whispering something Finn cannot quite hear across several repeated dreams, building tension purely through repetition, 3 separate nights of almost hearing him, until the final dream where he stands close enough that Finn finally gets the message, delivered with the flat, almost bored cruelty of someone who has said this exact sentence to 1,000 different dreamers before him. You blew it. That is what he tells Finn. Not a riddle, not a warning dressed up as a puzzle, just the plain outcome stated in advance about a breakup that has not happened yet. And when it does happen, when Flame Princess ends things with Finn, while the Ice King is simultaneously waging a small absurd war against her out of jealousy, the Ice King repeats the exact phrase back to him, word for word, as if the sentence itself had been waiting in the air the whole time for someone to finally say it out loud in the daylight. The episode that finally slows down and actually looks at him directly is called Hoots, and it is worth spending real time inside it because it does the thing Adventure Time does better than almost any other show ever made for a young audience. It takes something cosmic and terrifying and reveals that underneath the terror there is just loneliness, ordinary and specific and almost embarrassing in its smallness. The episode reveals that the cosmic owl has a job, an actual job, with duties and a system behind it, something closer to a bureaucratic position than a divine calling. He receives dream assignments through what appears to be a coin-based system, directives telling him which specific dreams he is required to visit on a given night, and once he shows up inside one, his presence alone locks that dream's contents into becoming real, whether or not anyone, including the dreamer, intended it that way. He lives, off-duty, in something the show calls a cosmic motel, a phrase that does an enormous amount of comedic and tragic work in 4 words, because it tells you immediately that whatever majesty you were imagining around this being, the actual reality is a rented room and a lack of anything better to do with the nights he is not working. He plays board games alone. He owns, according to the show's own details, only single-player board games, which is one of those small choices that could be a throwaway joke and is also, quietly, one of the saddest sentences in the entire series if you let it be. He is not, however, entirely without company. The show establishes a real friendship between the cosmic owl and Prismo, the wish-granting entity who lives outside of time itself, inside his own time room, and it is a friendship built almost entirely out of small, mundane rituals rather than anything cosmic. He shows up in Jake the Human, simply visiting Prismo, while Jake is in the middle of making his own wish, a guest dropping by the way that anyone drops by on a friend. He relaxes, according to the show's own details, in Prismo's jacuzzi, which is a detail almost too domestic to reconcile with everything else this being represents. And in Wake Up, he turns up at one of Prismo's own parties, specifically hoping for yet another round of a card game together, only to find Prismo distracted and irritable, uninterested in playing that particular night, and the cosmic owl simply leaves rather than push the matter, the way any friend eventually learns to read the room and go home early. There is something worth noticing in the fact that the two loneliest, strangest, most functionally bureaucratic entities in this entire mythology, one who enforces the literal outcome of the future, and one who grants wishes from a room suspended outside the flow of time altogether, are the ones who actually found each other and built something resembling an ordinary friendship out of it. Card games, a jacuzzi, showing up uninvited and leaving quietly when you're not wanted. Two beings holding an almost unimaginable amount of cosmic authority, choosing, in whatever time they have left over from running the machinery of fate, to spend it exactly the way anyone else might spend a slow Tuesday evening with a friend. In Hoots, he falls for a mysterious stranger, a woman referred to as the Bird Lady, and the show lets him have something resembling a heart for the length of one episode, before revealing, in the kind of twist that Adventure Time specializes in, that the Bird Lady is in fact the dream version of Gunter, the Ice King's favorite penguin, the same Gunter who would later turn out to be the compressed physical form of an ancient cosmic entity called Orgolorg, the Breaker of Worlds. So the cosmic owl, an ancient being tasked with enforcing the literal outcome of the future, falls in love inside a dream with the unconscious projection of another ancient being who does not even know what he is. Neither of them understands what the other one actually is. They are two enormous, terrifying, half-forgotten cosmic forces meeting inside a dream disguised as an owl chasing a bird-shaped stranger through a party, both of them just looking for company. The Bird Lady manipulates him, using his infatuation to gain access to Princess Bubblegum's dream, and once inside, corrupts it, turning it into a vision of the Candy Kingdom's citizens rising up against her and casting her out. And because the cosmic owl is present when it happens, the show tells you flatly that this is now locked in. It is no longer a bad dream. It is a scheduled event. And it happens later in the episode Hot Diggity Doom, when the candy people genuinely do turn against Princess Bubblegum and choose the con artist known as the King of Ooh as their new ruler instead. A single lonely bird, tricked by another lonely creature, neither of them understood, accidentally locked in the political collapse of an entire kingdom as a side effect of wanting somebody to talk to. There is a later chapter of his story, and I want to walk through it carefully because it is the closest the show ever comes to actually settling accounts with him, and it happens years after the main series ended, inside the Fiona and Cake spin-off in a special called The Bird and the Clock. By this point, the show has already revealed that the cosmic owl exists inside some kind of larger cosmic administrative structure, the same way death governs a realm with its own internal rules, and Prismo answers to whatever authority sits above the time room. He works, apparently, for someone. There is a character called Orbo who functions as his supervisor, and another figure called Scarab, a bounty hunter type keeping tabs on wanted individuals across the multiverse. And it turns out the cosmic owl has been sitting on a list of wanted entities since as far back as the show's very first season, flagged for something described only as profiteering, a charge that tells you, in one dry bureaucratic word, that whatever punishment was handed down to him for betraying his own twin brother did not stop him from finding ways to bend the system to his own benefit whenever nobody was checking closely enough. It is a small, human detail buried inside a cosmic entity. Even while serving out an eternal sentence, he apparently found an angle to work. What actually happens in The Bird and the Clock is one of the more quietly brutal sequences the franchise has ever produced. Finn is in critical condition, and the cosmic owl is formally assigned the job of delivering him a croak dream, the specific category of premonition that shows a dreamer exactly how they are going to die, the same category that once showed Jake suffocating in space without a helmet. Huntress Wizard, refusing to accept that this is simply how things have to go, chases the cosmic owl directly into the dream world to stop him before the dream can lock itself into becoming real. What follows is a pursuit through the sleeping minds of half the cast: Fiona, Cake, LSP, Marshall Lee, DJ Flame, each dream bleeding into the next as Huntress Wizard hunts a single owl across an entire unconscious landscape, using a connection between Fiona and the farm world version of Finn to finally corner him inside the dream that matters. And she kills him there. She kills the cosmic owl inside a dream, specifically to keep Finn's death from becoming locked in as unavoidable fate. It works, as far as the show lets us know. But here is the detail that unsettles me more than almost anything else in this entire mythology. Every dream he had already visited before that moment still comes true regardless. Small mundane fates like Cake stubbing her foot after dropping some toys, exactly as her earlier dream had shown. His death does not undo what he already set in motion. It only stops him from setting anything new in motion again. A being who spent his entire existence enforcing outcomes finally gets removed from the equation, and the outcomes he had already filed simply keep processing anyway, the way paperwork keeps moving through a system even after the clerk who stamped it has gone home for good. This is, I think, the actual shape of what the cosmic owl means inside this show, and it is worth carrying that shape with you into everything that follows tonight. because it turns out to explain far more of this world than one lonely bird alone. It is a verified fact, stated directly by the show across multiple episodes, that his presence in a dream guarantees the dream's outcome. It is a verified fact that this includes death through what the show calls croak dreams. It is a verified fact, revealed later in the Fiona and Cake spin-off series, that the cosmic owl was originally one half of a set of conjoined twins, and that after the two of them ate something they had been explicitly forbidden to touch, one brother betrayed the other, blaming him entirely for the theft in front of the deity who caught them. The betrayed brother was banished to a place called the undergrowth to process what the show describes as suppressed trauma, and became something called the karmic worm. The brother who did the betraying, the one who sold out his own twin to save himself, was punished by being made to spend eternity as the involuntary agent of destiny, forced to make people's darkest dreams come true, whether he wants to or not. What I am about to say next is speculation, clearly labeled as such, but I think it is worth saying anyway. If that origin is true, then the entire cosmic function of the cosmic owl, every croak dream, every quiet, devastating premonition, every small tragedy that gets locked into place the moment he steps into somebody's sleeping mind, is not really a punishment imposed on the world. It is a punishment imposed on him, and the rest of Oo just happens to be standing where the sentence gets carried out. He did something small and cowardly once, a betrayal born out of fear rather than cruelty, the kind of thing a scared kid does to save himself from getting in trouble, and the consequence the universe decided on was to turn him forever into the mechanism by which fate becomes unavoidable for everyone else. He is not malicious. He rarely intervenes directly. He mostly just shows up, does his job, and goes home to his motel to play a board game meant for one player. And I find that quietly more disturbing than almost any traditional villain the show ever produced, because there is no anger in him, no ambition, nothing you could call evil in any recognizable sense. There is only an old, sad loneliness, riding shotgun on inevitability, and a debt he is still paying off for something he did that the show never even lets us see. I want to sit for one more moment with the brother he left behind, because the show hands you a phrase about him that is almost clinical in a way nothing else in this mythology tends to be. The karmic worm was sent to a place called the undergrowth, specifically, in the show's own words, to process suppressed trauma, language that sounds less like a fairy tale sentence and more like something lifted directly out of a therapist's case notes. Most of Oo's punishments arrive dressed as spectacle: amber prisons, banishment to Mars, transformation into a penguin. This one is dressed as recovery. The karmic worm was not simply locked away to suffer. He was sent somewhere specifically built, apparently, to help him work through what had been done to him, an oddly gentle piece of cosmic justice tucked inside a universe that otherwise tends to hand out consequences with very little concern for anyone's healing. And his brother, the one who told the lie that got them both caught in the first place, received the opposite kind of sentence entirely. Not somewhere to heal, but a permanent job, an eternity of enforcing outcomes for other people while presumably never getting anywhere close to processing whatever guilt he might carry over what he did. One twin gets sent to therapy in whatever cosmic form that takes here. The other gets sent to work forever. If there is a harder, more quietly specific statement this show ever made about how differently the universe treats the person who was wronged versus the person who did the wronging, I have not found it yet. It is the kind of detail that rewards exactly the sort of patient, unhurried rewatching this whole layer of the mythology seems built for, sitting quietly in a single line of dialogue until someone finally goes looking for it on purpose. Go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are right now. I like knowing that people are scattered across so many corners of the actual world while they're listening to something like this. Now let's keep going because we've only just found the first door. Below the cosmic owl, structurally speaking, sits an entire economy of death that the show built out with far more rigor than its tone would suggest, and the ruler of that economy has a name that could not be more direct about what he is. He is simply called Death, and he governs a place called the Land of the Dead, sometimes referred to within the show as the Land of the End, along with a sprawling network of what are called the Dead Worlds. He is voiced in one of those quiet, real-world footnotes that gives certain fictional deaths an unintended weight by the actor Miguel Ferrer, whose own passing occurred not long after his final recorded appearances in the role, which is not something I am going to dwell on for shock value, but which is worth knowing because it changes how some of his later scenes land for people who know it. The mechanics of getting into the Land of the Dead are, true to the show's whole sensibility, absurd on the surface and unsettling once you actually picture them. A living person can cross over simply by staring into a corner where two walls meet and crossing their eyes. That is the entire ritual. No blood, no candles, no ancient incantation passed down through generations. Just a specific, slightly ridiculous physical trick, the kind of thing a bored kid discovers by accident while staring at a wall during a long car ride, except in this world, it opens a door into the realm of the dead. Once you are inside, the terrain is littered with wrecked police cars and crashed flying saucers and scattered bones, an aesthetic that suggests this place has been quietly absorbing pieces of every collapsed civilization for longer than anyone currently walking around in it could tell you. Skeleton people wander the landscape, hungry in the specific and uncomfortable way that only the dead in this show manage to be hungry, craving flesh with a directness that never gets played fully for laughs, no matter how the show frames the scene around it. At the heart of the realm is Death's Castle, built, according to the show's own visual language, out of light itself, containing inside it something closer to a Zen garden than a throne room. Boulders arranged with a strange calm amid all the wreckage outside, and a stage set up with instruments, because Death, when he is not collecting souls, apparently prefers to settle his business through music. This is one of the most purely Adventure Time details in the entire mythology, and it deserves to be said plainly. The ruler of the underworld resolves disputes and negotiates over lives through musical contests, specifically favoring double bass drums, and he is, verifiably, extremely good at it. Finn discovers this the hard way in the episode Death in Bloom, when he ends up in a drumming battle against Death himself, the stakes being nothing less than the restoration of Jake's stolen memory and the life of a small magical flower belonging to Princess Bubblegum, a flower Death had, offhandedly, already killed. Finn nearly loses. Death nearly kills him for losing, and the show does not blink away from that threat, does not soften it into something purely comedic, even while it keeps the tone light enough that a child watching would still laugh at some of it. What actually saves Finn is not skill or luck. It is a name he mentions, almost as a last resort, that he is friends with Peppermint Butler, and then everything shifts instantly. Death, without hesitation, resurrects the flower and restores Jake's memory, free of charge, purely on the strength of that one name. Picture the actual shape of that scene for a second, because the show stages it with more weight than the premise would suggest. A 12-year-old boy standing inside a castle built out of pure light, facing down the literal embodiment of every ending that has ever happened anywhere, agreeing to settle the fate of his best friend's memories through a percussion duel, the stakes made explicit before a single drumstick even comes down. Lose, and there will be consequences beyond simply walking away empty-handed. And then, in the middle of that enormous cosmic tension, the entire situation deflates the instant Finn says 4 ordinary words, "My friend, Peppermint Butler," and Death's whole posture changes, the way anyone's posture changes when a stranger turns out to know someone they respect. It is a small, human beat, dropped directly into the middle of the show's most literal encounter with the concept of dying, and it tells you something quietly important about how friendship functions as its own kind of currency inside this world, sometimes worth more than skill, more than power, more than anything you could otherwise bring to a negotiation with the end of everything. The crossing itself deserves a moment of its own attention too, because of how strange and unceremonious it is. There is no grand ritual gate, no glowing portal waiting in some sacred grove. Finn and Jake simply find a corner where 2 walls meet, the kind of ordinary architectural detail every building on Ooh has somewhere, and cross their eyes at it, the exact kind of silly trick a bored kid tries during a long afternoon, and the wall gives way to an entire hidden dimension on the other side. The show is telling you, without ever stating it directly, that the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead in Ooh is not some vast cosmic distance. It is thin. It is close. It is sitting quietly in the corner of nearly every room, waiting for someone to look at it the right way. We will come back to exactly why that name carries so much weight, because it is worth its own descent, its own layer down. But first, sit for a moment with what the land of the dead actually represents inside this show's cosmology, because it is more specific and more carefully built than almost any other piece of afterlife mythology in children's animation. Running through the realm is something called the River of Forgetfulness, a direct and acknowledged echo of the River Lethe from Greek mythology, the river that erases a soul's memory so that it can eventually be reincarnated clean. Anyone who drinks from it loses everything they remember instantly and completely. This happens to Jake within the show, and it is Death himself who eventually restores what was lost through something the mythology calls the kiss of death, a small, almost tender gesture for a figure otherwise defined by drumming contests and hunger and force fields of pure energy used to imprison and execute anyone who loses a music battle against him. And there is a detail buried in here that most casual viewers never clock, because the show delivers it with total flatness, no swelling music, no dramatic pause. There are beings who cannot be touched by death at all. The show refers to them through Marceline, using the word deathless, a term that applies to the Lich, to the ancient cosmic entity Orgolorg, and to Hunson Abadir, Marceline's own father and the ruler of the Nightosphere. It is later confirmed in the episode Wake Up that even Death himself is afraid of the Lich, a piece of information the show gives you in a single unhurried sentence, and then simply moves past, trusting you to feel the size of what that means without being told twice. Death, the ruler of every soul that has ever stopped living, the entity who can end anyone's immortality with nothing more than a small wobble of his skull-shaped head, is himself afraid of one specific ancient thing. There is a hierarchy above the hierarchy. Even the end has something it is scared of. Death eventually dies himself, later in the show's run, killed by a version of the Lich operating through a severed hand, possessed by the Lich's essence, an event the show handles with the same strange, understated seriousness it gives almost every genuinely enormous moment in its mythology. A new figure called New Death briefly rises in his place, and the ecosystem of the underworld does not simply collapse without him. It restructures the way any bureaucracy restructures after its director suddenly vanishes, which tells you something quietly unsettling about how mechanical and self-sustaining the entire system of dying really is in this universe. Death is important. Death is also, in the end, replaceable. The position hers outlives the person who holds it. There is a small detail about Death's musical habits that the show plants and never really explains, and I want to linger on it, because it is exactly the kind of thing this series does when it wants you to feel the personality of a cosmic force without spelling anything out. He is left-handed, not remarkably so, just quietly, the way a person simply is. But he plays a right-handed bass, restrung specifically so a left-handed player can use it, which is a strange and oddly domestic contradiction for a being who governs the entire population of everyone who has ever stopped living. Somewhere, at some point, Death picked up an instrument built for someone else's hands and decided to make it work for his own rather than waiting for one built correctly, and there is something almost touchingly ordinary about that, a small act of everyday adaptation performed by the single most permanent authority in the entire mythology. His musical contests are not limited to the drumming duel he has with Finn. The show establishes across multiple appearances that Death settles nearly all of his disputes this way, treating music as something closer to a binding legal contract than entertainment, and one of the heaviest examples of this comes buried inside the Sons of Mars storyline, where Abraham Lincoln ruling as the king of Mars, makes a deal with death to bring Jake back from the edge of death, offering as the price his own immortality. He commits what the show frames, quietly and without ceremony, as an act of sacrifice rather than simple negotiation, giving up the one thing that had kept him alive far longer than any ordinary person, so that a magical dog he had grown to respect could keep living instead. Storyboard material for the episode, originally intended to show the exact historical moment this immortality had been protecting him from all along, cutting to Ford's theater and the sound of the gunshot that killed the real Abraham Lincoln in American history, before the final aired version pulled back from showing the theater directly, keeping only the gunshot itself in the sound mix, implying without fully confirming what the audience is meant to understand happens next. It is one of the strangest and most quietly audacious pieces of world building the show ever attempted, folding an actual American president, already dead in our own timeline for well over a century, into its own cosmology of debts owed to death, without ever making the crossover feel like a stunt. There is also a piece of information about how death's authority actually gets tallied that is worth knowing purely because of how oddly bureaucratic it makes the entire concept of dying feel inside this universe. His rule extends across every one of what the show calls the dead worlds, with one specific and pointed exception: the 50th dead world, which requires someone already living inside that particular realm to personally grant him access before he can enter it at all. Even the ruler of every ending in existence does not have unconditional access to every corner of his own domain. There is a room, so to speak, that he cannot get into unless somebody already inside it opens the door for him. And the show eventually returns to this entire structure one final time, long after the main series ended, in material set decades beyond the finale, confirming what many longtime viewers had quietly assumed for years. Finn and Jake do eventually die of old age and cross into the land of the dead the same way any other soul would. What they find there, according to that later material, is a version of the underworld thrown into disarray, with New Death, the lesser entity who briefly inherited the position after the original Death's fall, now under the control of the same Lich Hand that killed his predecessor, forcing one final conflict inside the realm of the dead itself. A figure called Life, the show's answering counterpart to Death, intervenes directly, offering Finn something called the Kiss of Life to give him the strength for that last fight. I want to be honest about how far into speculative, mostly unconfirmed franchise territory this particular detail sits, since it comes from material describing events that occur well beyond the boundaries the main series ever dramatized on screen, and different pieces of it are treated with varying degrees of certainty, even among people who track this world closely. But the broad shape of it, that Finn and Jake eventually die like anyone else, that Death's realm keeps having its own internal power struggles long after the show stopped showing us its day-to-day operations, and that even Death has an opposite number named simply Life, tells you something important about how thoroughly this show built out its own afterlife as an actual functioning place, rather than a vague curtain that closes once a character's story is finished. Now we go to the name that saved Finn's life, in front of Death's own castle, because underneath the small, sweet, red and white candy exterior of Princess Bubblegum's most loyal servant is one of the most carefully hidden and, once you actually assemble the pieces, one of the most disturbing characters the show ever built. Peppermint Butler looks, on the surface, exactly like what his title suggests. A courteous, slightly fussy, entirely harmless butler serving the Candy Kingdom, present from the very first episode of the entire series, Slumber Party Panic, blending into the background the way good butlers are supposed to. He carries Princess Bubblegum when needed, cooks for the kingdom, occasionally acts as jailer, does thus all the small invisible labor that keeps a royal household running. And the show spends years, genuinely years of episodes, letting you believe that is the whole character before it starts, very quietly and very deliberately, showing you otherwise. The first real crack in the surface comes in Death in Bloom, where his friendship with Death himself is revealed almost as a throwaway detail, treated by the show with the same casualness it treats almost everything genuinely important. It is not until later episodes accumulate around this fact that its full weight becomes visible. In the background of Return to the Nightosphere, a single still image hangs on a wall, easy to miss unless you are looking for it. Hunson Abadir, the deathless ruler of the Nightosphere, and Marceline's own father, playing golf, with Peppermint Butler standing beside him, acting as his caddy. Sit with the calm domesticity of that image for a second. Not a battle, not a summoning ritual. A golf game. Peppermint Butler, carrying clubs for the literal Lord of Evil on some ordinary afternoon that the show never explains, never dates, never contextualizes, just quietly confirms happened. In Mortal Recoil, his instincts show a different kind of depth when he senses that Princess Bubblegum has been possessed by the Lich purely through a hiss, an involuntary, almost animal reaction of pure recognition toward genuine evil, a reaction none of the show's other characters display anywhere near as sharply. In The Suitor, he is shown to be capable of summoning an actual demon into another character's body with apparent ease, casually, in the middle of an episode that is ostensibly about matchmaking for Cinnamon Bun. In Nemesis, a character called Peacemaster hunts Peppermint Butler down specifically because of his connections to the Nightosphere, forcing him into a direct confrontation where he responds by astral projecting into a suit of magical armor and wielding a flaming sword, revealing capabilities that go far beyond anything a butler should reasonably possess. And in that same episode, the show plants a detail that recontextualizes everything. He is directly accused, to his face, of using dark magic to transform Peacemaster's own children into demon hybrids, an act of what can only honestly be called cruelty. And he does not deny it. He does not deny it. Adventure Time gives you a character who is loyal, funny, occasionally sweet, genuinely protective of Princess Bubblegum in moments that read as real affection, and then, without changing the tone of the show around him even slightly, lets him stand silently accused of transforming children into monsters as an act of personal revenge and simply moves on to the next scene. There is an earlier moment, easy to miss entirely on a first watch, buried in an episode called The Eyes, where Finn and Jake arrive on a scene involving a dead goblin and find Peppermint Butler standing right beside the body, with just enough ambiguity in how the moment is staged that the possibility he killed it himself is left hanging in the air rather than confirmed or denied outright. He deflects suspicion easily, almost too easily, claiming he simply found the goblin already dead, and Finn and Jake, characteristically, do not press the matter any further. The show never resolves this one way or the other. It simply lets the accusation sit there, unanswered, one more small dark thread woven into a character the show otherwise treats as comic relief for most of his screen time. And in Vamps About, his usefulness during Marceline's own vampire crises turns out to run far deeper than casual friendship would explain. He possesses enough specialized knowledge of vampire weaknesses to correctly identify, on sight, that the Hierophant belongs to an older, more traditional lineage, bound by the ancient rule against entering homes uninvited, and enough foresight to keep an actual vampire hunting kit on hand at all times, stocked with steaks and garlic, specifically in case Marceline herself ever turned against the people she loves. He never tells her he keeps it. When Bubblegum eventually learns about the kit's existence, she reacts with genuine anger at the implied distrust of her closest friend, but Marceline, tellingly, does not share that anger. She understands exactly why a kit like that would need to exist, and accepts, without resentment, that a butler with centuries of dark magic experience would be the one prepared enough to keep it. The title the show's own massive stone gumball guardians use for him is the most direct confirmation of how deep this actually goes. They call him, plainly, the Dark One, not a nickname earned through some misunderstanding, a title used by the literal defenders of the Candy Kingdom, the beings whose entire purpose is to recognize threats to Princess Bubblegum's safety. And there is a piece of speculation worth raising here, clearly marked as speculation, because it is widely discussed among people who track this material closely, and it is genuinely uncertain rather than confirmed. It appears, based on things Peppermint Butler says, and things Princess Bubblegum notably does not say in return, that she may not actually be aware of the full depth of what he does when he is not standing beside her. In Wizards Only Fools, she reveals a reflexive, almost comically absolute hostility toward the concept of magic itself, refusing to even acknowledge it as real while facing an actual death sentence for trespassing in Wizard City. If that hostility is genuine and not performative, and there is no confirmed evidence either way, it would mean she has built her entire kingdom, her entire life's work, standing next to a servant whose primary personal interest for centuries has quietly been the exact thing she refuses to look directly at, and neither of them has ever had the conversation that would force the truth into the light. Wizard City itself, the hidden community where so much of this magic actually gets practiced and regulated, runs on a strange and almost bureaucratic sense of self-importance that the show clearly finds a little ridiculous even while taking its underlying threat seriously. Entry requires nothing more than the correct password, a simple phrase confirming loyalty to the concept of wizardry itself. And once inside, the culture the show depicts is competitive and elitist in a very specific, insular way, guarding its own wizard battle tournaments jealously against outsiders and treating trespass by non wizards as an offense serious enough to warrant execution, a punishment the show plays partly for comedy when Bubblegum faces it, and partly, underneath the comedy, as a real and specific statement about how tightly this particular subculture polices its own borders. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of closed, self-regulating society that someone like Peppermint Butler could move through for years, developing a fearsome reputation without any of it ever reaching the ears of a princess who has made a point of refusing to acknowledge that this world exists at all. The special Wizard City, part of the Distant Lands anthology, finally goes looking for where all of this started, sending a younger version of Peppermint Butler into Wizard City itself, revealing a reputation among the wizarding community as one of the most feared magic users to ever pass through, someone who, according to stories told by younger wizards there, once stole forbidden magic, grew to enormous size, and destroyed part of the town, sparking what locals call the Great Gum Wars, before eventually, according to rumor within the special itself, being held by Golb. This is presented within a specific, self-contained storyline, and I want to be precise about what is verified within that special's own internal narrative versus what remains rumor even inside the fiction, because the special itself treats some of these details as local legend told by people who may not have gotten every fact right. What is not in question is the show's clear intention. Peppermint Butler earned his reputation the hard way, through real destruction, real fear, real consequences, long before he ever became the quiet, courteous figure carrying tea trays through the Candy Kingdom's hallways. And then there is the ending the show gives him, which recontextualizes everything one last time. In the series finale, after being struck by a magical substance called Dum Dum Juice during the Great Gumball War, an event meant to mentally incapacitate Princess Bubblegum, but which instead hits Peppermint Butler by accident, he is reduced entirely to infancy, stripped of every memory he ever carried, every alliance, every dark ritual, every carefully hidden decade of study. The final montage of the entire series shows him, now an infant, sitting somewhere in the Candy Kingdom, reading a simple picture book. Its title is Dark Magic 101. The show is telling you, in its very last images, that whatever he was, whatever centuries of secrecy and quiet horror he carried behind that courteous smile, the pull toward it survives even total memory loss. It is not something he learned. It is something closer to what he is. A baby who remembers nothing of his own life still somehow reaches, instinctively, for the one subject that defined it. Now go one level deeper, past the servant, into the dimension he has apparently been visiting on golf afternoons for who knows how long, because the nightosphere and the being who rules it deserve their own careful unpacking, and there is more real ache buried in this than the show's tone would ever let you guess from the outside. Picture the nightosphere itself for a moment before we go any further into what its ruler actually does, because the show never gives you a single establishing shot that explains the whole place at once, only fragments glimpsed through doorways and summoning circles, a churning reddish dark, shapes that might be architecture or might simply be more demons standing still long enough to look like buildings. An atmosphere the show's animators render less like a location with geography and more like a mood that happens to have physical edges. It is less a kingdom than a pressure, something you feel before you see, and Hudson Abadir moves through it the way a person moves through a house they have lived in so long they no longer notice the furniture. Hudson Abadir is Marceline's father, the ruler of the nightosphere, and, by his own description within the show, a being of chaotic evil who genuinely enjoys consuming souls. He is deathless, meaning that the entire concept of an ending simply does not apply to him the way it applies to nearly everyone else in this universe. He first appears in It Came from the Nightosphere, summoned by Finn without Marceline's full awareness or consent, an act driven by good intentions and a complete failure to understand what he was actually doing, since Marceline had spent considerable effort keeping her father exactly where he was. What follows is one of the show's quietest character studies, disguised as a Monster of the Week plot. Hudson storms across Ooh, sucking the souls out of nearly everyone he encounters, trapping them in glowing green sacks attached to his own head like some grotesque functional accessory, sparing almost no one, with two specific and telling exceptions. The Ice King, whom he simply frightens away rather than harming, and Gunter the Penguin, whom he identifies in a moment the show would only pay off years later as the single most evil thing he has ever personally encountered, a line that plays as a joke on first viewing and reads as a genuinely unsettling piece of foreshadowing once you know what Gunter actually is underneath his feathers. What finally stops Hudson is not force. It is a song. Finn plays back a recording he and Marceline had made earlier in the episode, an intensely personal piece of music Marceline had specifically asked him not to laugh at, built around her complicated feelings toward her own absent, soul-eating father. The recording distracts Hudson long enough for Finn to free the trapped souls, and in that pause, something genuine passes between father and daughter. Hudson apologizes, specifically, for an incident the show treats as almost absurdly small on its surface and devastating underneath it. Years earlier, he ate some of her French fries. That is the wound. Not a grand betrayal, not abandonment framed in mythic terms. A father who ate his daughter's fries once without asking and never seemed to notice how much it hurt her until she turned the hurt into a song because she had no other way left to hand it to him directly. He tells her, before being sent back into the nightosphere, that he loves her and means it in whatever damaged and complicated way a being defined by consuming souls is capable of meaning anything. The show returns to this relationship more than once, and every time it resists the easy version of the story. In Daddy's Little Monster, Hudson tries to manipulate Marceline into taking over the nightosphere entirely, framing it in his own strange way, as an act of fatherly pride, wanting to hand his daughter the family business the way any parent might want to pass down a legacy, except the legacy here is an entire dimension built on suffering. Marceline briefly wears the amulet that would make her its ruler, and the show lets her become genuinely cruel while wearing it, cold and monstrous in a way that frightens the people around her, before Finn and Jake manage to pull it off her and restore who she actually is. Hunson, in the end, lets her go. He does not force the inheritance on her, whatever else he is, and the show never asks you to forgive him for any of it. He does not make her become him. There is a specific piece of information about Hunson's own origins that is worth being extremely careful about, because it sits right on the line between verified show canon and material the fandom generally does not treat as fully authoritative. The Adventure Time Encyclopedia, a companion book to the series co-written by Martin Olson, the same actor who voices Hunson, and later expanded with contributions from Olivia Olson, who voices Marceline, includes a passage in which Hunson states that he does not remember his own origins, that he has existed since before time itself, from an era when, in his own words, there were only monsters, the same phrase and the same cosmological framing the show's main canon later uses to describe the Lich's own origins in the episode Gold Stars. I want to flag this clearly. The encyclopedia is generally treated as supplementary material rather than confirmed television canon, and the show itself has never stated this directly on screen. But it is a genuinely fascinating piece of world building, regardless of its canonical status, because it suggests, if taken at face value, that Marceline's own father belongs to the same impossibly ancient category of being as the Lich and Orgolorg, one of the things that existed in the dark before the universe had gotten around to inventing anything as orderly as physics. A being like that, having a daughter who plays bass guitar and writes songs about French fries, is either the show's sharpest piece of comedic contrast or its most quietly moving argument about what love looks like when it survives inside something enormous and broken, and I suspect, honestly, that it is both at once, on purpose. There is a small, almost funny piece of real-world production history behind the character's name that is worth knowing, purely because of how it undercuts the enormity of everything else attached to him. According to storyboard artist Jesse Moynihan, one of the show's key architects during its earlier seasons, the name Hunson Abadir originally came from something entirely unrelated to demons or the underworld. It was the name his own brother gave to a car they owned as kids. That is the actual origin of the name attached to a being the show elsewhere frames as having existed since before the universe had any physics to speak of. It is also worth noting, for anyone who enjoys tracing where a show's fictional names quietly borrow from older mythology, that the surname carries an echo of Abaddon, a name used across older religious texts to refer variously to a destroying angel or to a specific region within Hell itself, though the show itself never states this connection outright, and I raise it only as an interesting piece of etymology rather than confirmed authorial intent. Hunson is not, by the way, the only demon of real consequence tied to this corner of the mythology. A separate figure called Keoth surfaces in the show's world as well, generally understood by people who track the Nightosphere's internal hierarchy closely to occupy some rank of demon, distinct from Hunson's own position as its ruler, though the show is characteristically vague about exactly how its infernal chain of command is organized, never handing the audience an org chart, only glimpses. What the show does but make clear, through Hunson's own words, is that Gunther, at the time still nothing more than a beloved and mildly destructive penguin belonging to the Ice King, struck him as the single most evil thing he had personally ever encountered, a joke on first hearing, and, once Orgolorg finally airs several seasons later, something closer to an accidental, deadly accurate diagnosis delivered by a demon lord who had no idea just how right he actually was. Now we go sideways rather than only downward, because the Nightosphere connects directly into another layer of the show's underworld mythology that most casual viewers never fully assemble. The vampires, who are not simply a monster of the week concept, but an entire structured court built deliberately around the imagery of tarot cards, and whose full history runs directly through Marceline in a way that reframes almost everything you think you know about her. The core fact, verified plainly across the miniseries, stakes, and confirmed on the show's own wiki and in Wikipedia's own coverage of the character, is this. Marceline was not born a vampire. She spent an era of her long life actively hunting them in the aftermath of the Mushroom War, protecting the last scattered remnants of the human race from a surge of vampires who had begun preying on survivors. She discovered, through her own demonic heritage, that killing a vampire allowed her to absorb their unique abilities into herself, one power at a time, accumulating strength the same way a collector accumulates pieces of a set. This worked well against every vampire she faced, until she went after the one at the top of the entire hierarchy, the Vampire King himself. In that fight, rather than simply defeating her, he bit her. She still managed to kill him afterward, but the damage, so to speak, had already been done. The bite turned her. The huntress became, permanently, the thing she had spent so long hunting, and inherited, by simple default, the title of the very last surviving vampire on Ooh. Vampire Queen, not out of ambition, out of attrition, she won the war and lost herself in the same fight. Centuries later, having grown tired of what vampirism had made her, and specifically wanting, in her own words, to grow up, Marceline asks her closest friend, Princess Bubblegum, to try to extract the vampiric essence from her body entirely, hoping to become mortal again. This is where the mini-series, Stakes, actually begins, and it is worth knowing that the entire vampire court she once wiped out did not simply disappear when she killed them. Their essences had been living inside her, dormant, absorbed alongside their powers, and Bubblegum's extraction process accidentally releases 5 of them back into independent existence: the Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon, and the Vampire King himself, each one deliberately built by the show's rowers around a specific card from the tarot deck's major arcana, their personalities and powers drawn directly from what those cards traditionally represent. The Fool embodies innocence and reckless spontaneity, and is, fittingly, the easiest of the five to defeat. The Empress represents seduction and abundance, using hypnosis and invisibility to manipulate her enemies. The Hierophant represents rigid, traditional order, a vampire who genuinely believes the old ways were correct, and that adapting to the changing world is what doomed their kind in the first place, and who is bound, as a direct consequence of clinging so hard to tradition, by the oldest and most restrictive vampire rule of all. He cannot enter a home uninvited, a limitation that ultimately kills him when he is accidentally knocked into a house he was never welcomed into. The moon, quiet and almost never acknowledged even by her own fellow vampires, represents dreams, illusion, and deception, and possesses a self-healing ability so powerful that neither ordinary stakes nor direct sunlight can permanently harm her, forcing Marceline and her friends to hunt her using patience and misdirection rather than force. And the Vampire King himself carries the weight of three separate cards at once: the Wheel of Fortune, the Emperor, and a broader authority that lets him command telekinesis, teleportation, telepathy, and even the manipulation of water, making him, by a wide margin, the single most powerful member of the entire court. When the newly resurrected court cannot agree on how to rebuild their numbers, the Empress breaks away from the others and heads straight for the Ice Kingdom, intending to gather new recruits from among the frozen, half-forgotten corners of Simon's own territory. And the moment Marceline hears where she has gone, something in her shifts immediately from strategy into something closer to panic. She does not send someone else. She goes herself, fearing specifically for the Ice King's safety, dropping whatever careful plan the group might have had in favor of getting to him before the Empress can. It is a small detail, easy to miss inside a miniseries otherwise built around bigger set pieces, but it says everything about where Marceline's real loyalties sit, even 1,000 years into a friendship that spends most of its screen time looking like comic bickering. With Finn and Bubblegum's help, she catches the Empress before any harm reaches him and kills her there, reabsorbing the power of invisibility that had made her so difficult to pin down in the first place. The Ice King never fully understands how close any of this came to him. He rarely does. Most of the show's real danger passes within a few feet of him and slides past unnoticed, the way weather passes over someone who has already stopped looking at the sky. The hunt for the moon is worth picturing slowly, because it is one of the stranger, quieter sequences the miniseries builds, closer in mood to a ghost story than an action scene. She leaves the rest of the court behind after their arguments grow too loud for her taste, drifting off toward a lake on her own, and she marks her path the entire way with what the show calls moon pearls, small, glowing orbs left behind almost like breadcrumbs, whether she intends them as a trail or simply as residue of what she is, does not seem to matter to her either way. Finn and Jake follow that trail specifically during daylight hours, since she is dangerous enough that darkness would tilt every advantage toward her, and they eventually find her resting inside an urn aboard an old, half-sunken pontoon boat, asleep in a way that reads less like ordinary sleep and more like something patient and ancient, simply waiting out the hours until conditions favor it again. When night finally falls and she wakes, she pursues them with a speed that catches everyone off guard, chasing them all the way into Peppermint Butler's own laboratory inside the Candy Kingdom, where she dispatches Marceline's friends with unsettling ease before Peppermint Butler himself finally stuns her using a stake large enough to look almost comedic, giving Marceline the opening she needs to reabsorb the healing power that had made the moon so difficult to permanently harm in the first place. The Hierophant's confrontation carries a different texture entirely, closer to old formal cruelty than supernatural mystery. He tracks Marceline down, specifically hoping to broker an alliance against the Vampire King, offering cooperation on the explicit condition that she abandon the more restrained, modern relationship she has built with feeding on color rather than blood, a condition she refuses outright, because whatever else vampirism took from her, it never took her insistence on doing things her own way rather than the old way. When he attacks her in response, it is with poison delivered through a shape-shifted scorpion's tail, an old-fashioned, almost theatrical method of violence that fits a vampire who has spent his entire existence insisting the old ways were correct. Jake, remembering the specific and ancient rule that binds vampires like him, shapeshifts his own body into the shape of a house, giving everyone shelter the Hierophant cannot legally cross without an invitation he will never receive. It is only an accident, a stumble from another character named Crunchy, that finally sends him tumbling across that threshold uninvited, and the old rule he spent the entire episode defending as sacred is the exact rule that kills him. What happens at the end of Stakes is one of the more quietly strange character resolutions in the show's history. The Vampire King, upon finally confronting Marceline and her allies again, declares that he no longer wants to be a vampire at all. Not defiance, not a final grand villain speech. Simple, tired renunciation. Bubblegum uses the same extraction device on him that had been used on Marceline, stripping his vampiric essence away and leaving him transformed into a harmless, ordinary lion, apparently content to live out whatever remains of his existence without any of the power he once commanded. The extracted essence itself, rather than simply dissipating, detonates into something new and monstrous, a mass the show calls the Dark Cloud, forcing one final confrontation. And in the middle of that final battle, Marceline nearly gives up entirely, worn down by the accumulated weight of centuries spent fighting the same enemies over and over, in different shapes, for reasons that never seem to actually end. It is the Ice King, of all people, who talks her back into fighting, in a small, understated scene that becomes one of the emotional cores of the entire miniseries. A man who has spent 1,000 years losing pieces of himself to a magical curse, sitting with a woman who has spent the same 1,000 years fighting to keep pieces of herself intact, each of them recognizing something in the other's exhaustion that nobody else in their lives could fully understand. Before any of that hunting ever began, Marceline was simply a child. Her human mother, a woman named Elise, died sometime around or shortly after the Mushroom War, leaving Marceline alone in the wreckage of a collapsing civilization, half demon and entirely unprotected, until Simon Petrikov found her wandering through the ruins and made the quiet, instinctive decision to take care of her. That relationship, the one this channel has already spent an entire other video sitting with closely, is the emotional root system that everything about her later vampirism eventually grows out of. A girl who lost her mother to the war, who was raised for a time by a man slowly losing his own mind to a cursed crown, who was eventually abandoned by that same man out of his own fear of what he might do to her, does not arrive at her vampire hunting years as a blank slate. She arrives as someone who has already lost nearly everyone who was ever supposed to protect her, and who decides, on her own, to become the thing that protects everyone else instead. The vampires she hunts are, in a very real sense, simply the newest and most literal predators threatening the last remaining humans on Earth, and she takes that job on herself the way she takes on almost everything difficult in her life, alone, without waiting for anyone to ask her to. Her relationship with Princess Bubblegum runs on a nearly identical emotional logic underneath all the show's careful hesitation to name it outright for most of its run. The implication surfaces clearly enough in the third season episode, What Was Missing, that it sparked real conversation among viewers who recognized exactly what they were watching, even though the show never used the word to describe it. And it deepens further in Sky Witch, before the finale. Come Along With Me finally lets the two of them kiss without ambiguity, closing a loop the show had been quietly tending for years. The Distant Lands special, Obsidian, goes back and finally shows the actual falling out between them directly, something the main series had always left as an unexplained gap in their history, and treats their reconciliation with enough sincerity and craft that it earned a GLAAD Media Award nomination for Outstanding Kids and Family Programming. What Obsidian ultimately reveals is almost disappointingly ordinary in the best possible sense. Two people who loved each other, hurt each other in the specific, survivable ways people who love each other tend to hurt one another, and then spent years being apart for reasons that felt enormous at the time, and shrink with distance into something closer to a shared regret. Adventure Time spends an extraordinary amount of care making sure that even its 1,000-year-old vampire queen gets a love story built on the same small human logic as everyone else's. Even with all 5 of those absorbed powers eventually settled inside her for good, the show never lets Marceline's vampirism rid as glamorous or fully under control, and it is worth sitting with the specific, unglamorous mechanics of what she actually carries because of it. She cannot see her own reflection in a mirror, a detail the show treats as simple background fact rather than tragedy, though it is hard not to feel the weight of it anyway. A 1,000-year-old woman who has never once, in all that time, been able to look directly at her own face in glass or still water. She can move through direct sunlight if she takes precautions. A parasol, a wide hat, long gloves, though she describes the sensation of doing so as something like scraping a knee, a small, constant, manageable pain she has simply learned to live inside, rather than a wound that ever fully heals. When she goes too long without what she needs, the color red in whatever form she can find it, she drops into what the show calls the feral state, losing the version of herself that jokes and plays bass and looks after the people she loves, replaced temporarily by something closer to pure hunger. She does, on occasion, and by her own admission, still drink actual blood rather than simply consuming color, a detail the show never dwells on or moralizes about, just states plainly and moves past, the same way it handles almost everything about her that would be horror in a different, less patient kind of story. None of this reads as monstrous on screen. It reads, instead, like the ordinary maintenance of an ordinary life, except the life happens to be 1,000 years long, and the maintenance happens to involve blood and sunlight and a face she will never see reflected back at her. There is a phrase Marceline uses during one of her flashback confrontations with the Vampire King that deserves to be sat with directly rather than rushed past, because it might be the single bleakest sentence in the entire show, delivered with almost no emphasis, the way the worst truths in this series always seem to arrive. She tells him that everything repeats over and over again, and that no one learns anything because no one lives long enough to see the pattern. Say that back to yourself slowly. It is a statement about the entire mortal population of Oo, made by one of the only characters old enough to actually witness the repetition she is describing. Everyone else gets exactly one lap around the same tragic loop and then dies before they can recognize it as a loop at all. Only Marceline and a handful of other similarly ancient beings get to watch the same mistakes happen again and again across centuries, powerless to convince anyone in the moment that they have seen this exact shape of grief before, because by the time the pattern becomes visible, the person living through it the first time is already gone. That is not a line about vampires. That is a line about what it costs to survive. Everyone you have ever loved, spoken by someone doing exactly that in real time, disguised as a comment made in the middle of a fist fight. And both the Hierophant and the Vampire King, in separate flashback scenes, reference something they call a price that Marceline has not yet paid for the powers she carries, a debt implied rather than fully explained on screen, but heavily suggested to connect to a much larger concept that the show only properly names in one specific, strange, deeply underrated episode. So let us go there now, because this is the layer beneath the layer, the theory that quietly explains almost every broken magic user in the entire series, and it was handed to the audience once, clearly, in an episode most casual viewers barely remember. The episode is called You Forgot Your Floaties, and on the surface it looks like a minor, slightly bizarre entry involving Magic Man and Betty Groff conducting some kind of ritual in a basement, Finn and Jake getting transformed into an egg and a lump of dough, respectively, for reasons that are never fully explained and do not particularly need to be, and a recurring, unsettling image of a coconut crab climbing out of a swimming pool. Underneath all of that, Betty says something that the show never repeats, never underlines with music, never returns to directly again in dialogue, and that nonetheless retroactively explains an enormous portion of everything tragic that happens to every wizard across the entire series. She calls it magic, madness, and sadness. Her own theory, developed specifically because she has spent years trying to find a cure for what happened to Simon Petrikov, is that every single user of real magic she has ever studied displays some combination of these three traits together in varying degrees, as though they are not separate phenomena at all, but three expressions of one single underlying force running through anyone who touches true magic. Magic Man, without her even prompting him, independently uses almost the exact same language, describing it as a circuit, magic, madness, and sadness, moving through him like something wired into his own nervous system, rather than something that simply happened to him from the outside. Betty's own surname is not a random collection of syllables. It is a direct homage to Stanislav Grof, a real psychiatrist widely credited as one of the founding figures of transpersonal psychology, a field concerned specifically with altered states of consciousness and the ways extraordinary mental experiences reshape a person's sense of identity, which makes the choice of name feel less like a coincidence and more like a quiet piece of authorial commentary on exactly what her research inside the show is actually studying. She is not simply a woman trying to save her fiancé. She is, structurally, the show's resident psychiatrist for magic itself, running her own quiet, obsessive research program into the psychological toll that power takes on the people who carry it, using the only case study she has ever really needed, the man she loved before a crown took him from himself. There is a specific piece of imagery inside the episode that the show never explains but keeps returning to, an image of a coconut crab surfacing again and again out of a dark swimming pool, and the closest the show comes to naming what that pool represents is a phrase Betty herself uses, describing every magic user she has ever studied as swimming together in something she calls the loomy gloom, a kind of shared psychic depth that all of them apparently sink into and struggle to breathe inside. I am not going to pretend the show hands you a clean, tidy definition of what the loomy gloom actually is, because it does not, and any confident explanation of the phrase beyond what the episode itself shows you would be speculation dressed up as certainty. But the image itself does real work regardless of how precisely you can define it. Magic, in this show, is something people go under into, not something they simply hold in their hands, and some of them, like Betty, forget, right at the moment it matters most, to bring anything that might keep them afloat. What the episode does next is the part that most recaps skip past too quickly, because it is genuinely upsetting once you actually picture it happening. Betty undergoes a ritual specifically designed to transfer Magic Man's own trifecta into herself, taking on his magic, his madness, and his sadness all at once, in an act of raw, deliberate self-sacrifice, undertaken purely because she believes it might eventually let her understand and reverse whatever the crown did to Simon. The ritual succeeds, but not cleanly. Magic Man, stripped of his own magic, madness, and sadness, for the first time in who knows how long, becomes something the show literally starts calling normal man, sane and powerless, and disoriented by his own sudden, ordinariness. And Betty, who walked into that basement as one of the only fully human, fully grounded characters left in the show's mythology, walks out of it transformed, unstable, newly and permanently touched by the exact affliction she had spent years trying to cure in someone else. The episode ends with her disappearing in a burst of chaotic magic, laughing in a way the show clearly wants you to read as unsettling rather than triumphant. Magic Man's own madness has a specific origin the show reveals in careful pieces across several episodes, and it fits the exact pattern Betty was trying to isolate almost too neatly. He is, it turns out, the estranged brother of Grob Gob Glob Grod, the four-faced deity generally treated as something close to a governing god over the planet Mars, and he was exiled to Earth roughly 200 years before the events of the show for crimes the series never spells out in detail, banished by siblings who, despite everything, never stopped considering him family. Somewhere in his past, before that exile, he lost someone named Margles, a woman whose photograph he keeps displayed on a shelf throughout the show, visible in scenes long before anyone bothers to ask who she is. It is eventually revealed that Margles was taken by Golb, the same entity the Lich claims to serve as a devoted scholar, the same entity that would later dissolve Simon's connection to his own crown at the very end of the series. Magic Man spends the show's run insisting that nothing messes him up, that he is unbothered by his own brother's apparent destruction, immune to grief in a way none of the other wizards around him seem to be. Betty does not believe him, and the show does not ask you to believe him either. When she finally undergoes the ritual that strips his magic, madness, and sadness away and transfers all three into herself, the result gives you the clearest confirmation the show ever offers of what that trifecta was actually doing to him the entire time. Freed of it, he becomes calm, ordinary, capable of simple, unremarkable kindness, eventually rebuilding a real life for himself as a helper to his own estranged family, a version of himself he could apparently never access, while all of that magic, madness, and sadness was still running through him like a live wire. Whatever Margles' loss did to him, it is inseparable in the show's own internal logic from whatever the magic itself was doing. Here is where I want to be careful again about what is confirmed and what is my own reading laid on top of it, because I think this detail is one of the most quietly important pieces of world building in the entire show, and I do not want to overstate its official status. The show never states outright, in so many words, that this exact mechanism is what happened to Simon Petrikov when he first put on the ice crown 1,000 years earlier. But look at the shape of it. A person encounters magic. The magic transfers something into them, not just power, but a kind of psychic cost bundled into the same package, arriving whether or not the person asked for it, arriving whether or not they even understand what they are receiving. Simon puts on a crown he bought from a stranger, expecting, at most, an interesting historical artifact worth studying, and instead receives centuries of slowly accumulating madness alongside the power over ice and snow that keeps him alive through the collapse of human civilization. Betty absorbs Magic Man's own trifecta directly, on purpose, hoping to use it constructively, and instead loses her own stability almost immediately. Marceline absorbs power from every vampire she kills and gets bitten by the very last one, carrying from that point forward both an eternal youth and an eternal grief she will still be describing 1,000 years later as a pattern nobody else lives long enough to recognize. The show is quietly suggesting, through at least three completely separate storylines that never directly reference one another, that magic in this universe is never simply power. It is always power bundled with a cost that the wielder rarely gets to negotiate, a tax collected in sanity and grief rather than currency, paid out gradually across however many years the magic decides to let you keep living. Even the Cosmic Owl and Peppermint Butler and Hunson Abadir, none of whom the show ever formally files under the word wizard, seem to be running on some distant variation of the exact same circuit, power arriving bundled with a private, ongoing cost that nobody around them ever fully sees. And if that reading holds, even loosely, it changes how the Ice King's entire arc lands. He is not simply a man cursed by an evil crown in some generic fantasy sense. He is, according to the internal logic Betty herself laid out in a mostly forgotten mid-series episode, exhibiting the textbook symptoms of what happens to anyone who touches real magic in this world, just at an unusually advanced and irreversible stage, because he wore the source of it directly on his head for 1,000 consecutive years, while almost everyone else who ever gets touched by this trifecta only absorbs a fraction of it, once, briefly, and mostly survives the encounter with their sense of self intact. Betty spent years of her own extended life researching exactly this phenomenon, trying to find where the circuit could be broken, and the show's answer, delivered with characteristic quietness in the finale, is that it eventually can be broken, but only by something even larger than the magic itself. It takes an encounter with Golb, the entity the Lich himself describes as an embodiment of pure chaos, something the Lich claims to serve as a devoted scholar, something so vast that things which enter its body get unmade and reassembled into simplified versions of themselves. Inside Golb, whatever bound the crown's power to Simon's body gets stripped away entirely, and he becomes, for the first time in 1,000 years, simply Simon Petrikov again. Old, powerless, sane. The magic, the madness, and the sadness Betty spent so long trying to isolate and understand finally separate from him, not because anyone found a cure, but because something bigger than the disease swallowed the entire system whole and spat out what was left. But freedom for Simon does not come free for Betty, and this is where the whole theory she spent years building finally closes its own circuit on the person who started it. Once he is free of the crown, old and sane and standing inside a chaos entity, with the fiancée he lost 1,000 years earlier finally beside him again, it is Betty who makes the choice neither of them ever gets to fully discuss out loud. She uses the crown herself, one last time, and instead of simply escaping Golb the way the others do, she merges with it directly, becoming a new fused entity the show names, plainly and almost gently, Golbetti. She does not ask Simon's permission. She does not wait for him to weigh in on whether this is a fair trade. She has already spent 1,000 years of her own extended, magic touched life pursuing exactly this outcome, and when the moment to actually make the trade finally arrives, she makes it alone, the same way she absorbed Magic Man's own magic, madness, and sadness alone, the same way she has done almost everything that mattered in her long, strange life without waiting for anyone else's blessing first. Simon gets his sanity back. Betty gets folded into the single most chaotic entity the show's mythology contains. The theory she spent years developing, magic, madness, and sadness moving through anyone who touches real power, turns out to describe her own ending as precisely as it ever described his. Which brings us, at last, to the deepest layer, the place where all of these separate threads, the dreaming bird doing penance for a childhood betrayal, the underworld ruled by a musician who fears something even older than himself, the butler with a golfing habit and a secret history of destruction, the demon father who never got over stealing his daughter's fries, the tarot court of vampires paying a price no one ever fully explains, and the quiet, terrible theory that magic itself always comes bundled with madness and grief, actually connect into something resembling a single, unified idea about what this show believes death, dreams, and power actually are. None of these systems in Adventure Time function like clean machinery. None of them are fair in any recognizable sense, and the show never once pretends otherwise, even while it keeps its tone gentle enough for a child to fall asleep to. The cosmic owl did not choose the punishment that turned him into an instrument of unavoidable fate. It was handed to him after one small, scared act of betrayal committed, as far as the show ever tells us, when he was young and frightened and trying to save himself from trouble long before he ever understood what that single choice would cost him across the rest of forever. Death did not choose to be feared by something even he is afraid of. That hierarchy simply exists above him, unquestioned, unexplained, permanent. Peppermint Butler did not choose whatever original wound or curiosity first pulled him toward a dark magic centuries ago, and even total memory loss, a complete erasure of every experience that ever shaped him, was not enough to pull him away from it once his mind started rebuilding itself from nothing. Marceline did not choose to become the last vampire on Oo. She chose only to fight, and the fight itself decided the rest for her, the way fights against something ancient and cornered often decide more than anyone intends going in. And Betty did not choose madness either. She walked toward it deliberately, with full awareness of the risk, purely because loving someone who had already been lost to exactly that same affliction seemed to her worth the exchange. What I think Adventure Time is actually saying, underneath the comedy and the candy colors and the penguins and the bass guitar solos, is that in this particular universe, power of any real kind, the power to see the future, to command the dead, to bend reality through magic, to live for 1,000 years without aging, never arrives free of cost, and the cost is almost never something the person who receives it gets meaningfully to negotiate. It arrives the way grief arrives. It arrives the way loss arrives, uninvited, disproportionate, and permanent, changing the shape of a life whether or not that life was ready to be changed. and the characters who survive it, with anything resembling their humanity intact. Marceline learning, slowly, to let herself be loved again after 1,000 years of loss. Simon finding his way, after everything, back to a life worth choosing, even without Betty in it. Even Peppermint Butler, in whatever strange, compromised way his loyalty to Princess Bubblegum has always functioned as something genuinely good sitting right next to something genuinely dark, are not the ones who escaped the cost. They are simply the ones who kept living anyway, once the bill had already come due. There is a real-world layer sitting quietly underneath all of this fictional one, and I think it belongs here too, because it says something about why these particular corners of the mythology feel as personal as they do. Adam Muto, one of the show's own creators and eventual showrunner, has directly confirmed how significant the cosmic owl was meant to be within the larger structure of the series, not simply a recurring gag, but a genuine thread the writers kept pulling on for years. The role itself passed through two different actors over the show's run, voiced first by Jeremy Shada, the same actor who plays Finn, before shifting to the late M. Emmett Walsh for the character's later appearances, an older, heavier voice replacing a younger one, which is its own small, unplanned echo of the way Finn's own voice deepened across the series as Shada grew into adulthood alongside the character he was playing. Death's voice belonged to Miguel Ferrer, whose real death, not long after recording his final scenes, means that every later appearance of that character carries a weight the writers could never have intended when they first cast him. Weight that exists now only because two timelines, one fictional and one real, happened to end up standing close enough together that you cannot always tell which one you are grieving. And Marceline's family tree runs directly through the real families of the people who built it. Her father, Hunson, voiced by Martin Olson, Marceline herself, voiced by Olivia Olson, who is, in the world outside the show, Martin's own adopted daughter, meaning a real father spent years voicing the demon father of the character his real daughter played, an arrangement so quietly strange that no writer could have engineered it on purpose, and yet it sits at the center of one of the show's most affecting relationships. Rebecca Sugar, credited as a songwriter across the series and eventually the creator of her own landmark show, voiced Marceline's human mother, Elise, in the character's small handful of flashback appearances, meaning the woman who wrote so many of the show's most devastating songs also gave her own voice, briefly, to the mother whose death set the entire chain of loss in motion. The show's afterlife, in other words, was never built by people at a safe distance from what they were making. It was built quietly and repeatedly out of its own creator's real relationships, real losses, real families, folded into a cartoon about a boy and his dog, until the line between the fiction and the people making it got thin enough that you could see through it if you knew where to look. That, I think, is why this particular layer of the show's mythology gets skipped over so often by casual conversation, even among people who love this series deeply. It is not built for easy quoting or highlight reels. There is no single triumphant moment where someone defeats the cosmic owl and reclaims their own future. No clean scene where Peppermint Butler renounces dark magic forever. No tidy resolution, where the tarot court of vampires simply stops existing and the price attached to magic gets permanently repealed. The show just keeps showing you, quietly, patiently, across 10 seasons and several spin offs, that some debts do not get canceled. They only get carried by whoever is still standing for as long as they happen to keep living. And the show's real tenderness, the thing that makes it worth all this time spent looking at its darkest corners, is that it never once suggests those people are wrong for continuing to try anyway. There is something fitting, I think, in the fact that so much of this particular layer of the mythology runs through sleep itself, through the specific unguarded hour when a person stops steering their own mind and lets whatever is underneath finally surface. You are, right now, listening to this in the dark, maybe with your eyes already closed, maybe drifting toward the exact state where the cosmic owl does his work, and there is a strange, quiet symmetry in that. The show kept building its darkest, most carefully hidden architecture into the one part of daily life every single viewer already shares completely, awake or not, human or candy person or magical dog. Everyone dreams. Everyone, eventually, crosses over into whatever the land of the dead is standing in for in their own life. Everyone, at some point, touches something that changes them more than they agreed to be changed, and carries the cost of it forward for however long they have left, the way Simon carried the crown, the way Marceline carried the bite, the way Betty carried a theory that ended up describing her own ending before it ever cured anyone else's. Adventure Time hid its heaviest ideas inside the parts of its own world where nobody is fully in control: sleep and death and magic, the three places where a person stops being entirely the author of what happens to them, and it did this inside a cartoon that most of the world still remembers primarily for a boy, a dog, and a kingdom made of candy. That contrast is not an accident, and it is not simply clever. It is, I think, the whole argument the show was quietly making the entire time, that the most honest stories are the ones that let you keep laughing at the surface, while something true and difficult keeps moving underneath it, waiting for you to notice in whatever quiet hour you finally slow down enough to look. The land of Ooh keeps its dead close, and its dreamers closer, and somewhere in a rented room shaped like a cosmic motel, a lonely bird who betrayed his own brother a very long time ago is probably setting up a single-player board game right now, getting ready for another night of walking into somebody's sleep and making sure the worst parts of their future actually happen, because that is simply the job he still owes the universe, whether he wants it or not. If any of this found you somewhere quiet tonight, if you're the kind of person who likes sitting with the parts of a story that don't get talked about as often, it would genuinely mean a lot if you left a like on this video and considered subscribing to the channel, because that's exactly the kind of exploring we do around here, going past the surface everybody already knows and down into the parts of Ooh that most people walk right past without ever looking twice. There's more down there. There always is, in a world this carefully built, and we'll keep finding it together, one quiet corner at a time. Rest easy. The land of Ooh will keep until we come back for it.